Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala tayyibin at-tahirin. In the second chapter, we discuss development of transcendent philosophy. We have very good introduction here. You might be familiar with this already to some extent. For example, when we had introduction to Kalam by Ayatollah Mutahhari, we discussed some of these issues. When we had philosophy, sometimes also we discussed these things, like especially the first book on philosophy, basic philosophy, Falsafi Muqaddamati, and some other, also in introduction to philosophy, we discussed some of these things. But here there is very good comprehensive discussion, and it helps you a lot to give you a framework for studying history of intellectual sciences, especially theology, philosophy, mysticism. This is very good, and then of course with other things you can complete it. Before Mulla Sadra, there were three major attitudes towards important questions, fundamental questions of philosophy. For example, is reality one or multiple? Wahdat ya kathrat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's essence, attributes, existence, qualities, actions, about hudus o qadam. This world is created or eternal, human spirit is created or eternal, about resurrection. So there were three major attitudes. One was the attitude of philosophers. So philosophical outlook to the world. Philosophical worldview. He calls it Jahanbiniya Falsafi. The second was Kalami or theological attitude or worldview. Jahanbiniya Kalami. And the third was mystical attitude or worldview. Jahanbiniya Irfani. So mystics had one kind of attitude, Mutakallimin had another, and philosophers had another. First, we mentioned some of the characteristics of these three, but then we will explain that even in philosophy, we didn't have just one attitude. Before Mulla Sadra, in philosophy, we had two currents. We had peripatetic philosophy and we had illuminationist philosophy. In Kalam also, we didn't have one. So we'll talk about this. But generally speaking, three general attitudes: philosophical, theological, and mystical. Philosophical worldview is based on aql, on reason. The foundations are rooted in badihiyat aqliyah, self-evident propositions. And the methodology is also aqli, is rational. And the way things develop are also based on reasoning. So this is a general description of philosophical attitude. Mystical worldview is not based on philosophical argumentation. The roots, they are not based on badihiyat aqli. They are based on kashf wa shuhud, based on mystical findings. And this can be through intuition, can be, mystical experiences. A mystic uses his mystical findings as foundation. Instead of badihiyat aqli here, kashf wa shuhud serve as foundation, but then by using aql, they may draw implications out of them. So if you study transcendent philosophy, they make lots of reasoning, but in order to draw implications from mystical findings. Theological worldview or kalami is mainly rooted in naql, in transmitted knowledge, revelation, hadith, Quran, hadith. They want to, as we said before, do three things. They want to explain religious ideas, to argue for them, and to defend them. When it comes to arguing and defending, of course, they use aql as well. For example, they may argue for existence of God through aql. Part of ilahiyat is aqli, or in the West they say natural theology is aqli. So they use aql, they use naql. Maybe they sometimes use science, even empirical sciences, to defend or even maybe to argue for religious ideas. So this is about three of them. Now, if you go into more details, philosophical worldview before Mulla Sadra was not only one unique approach. There were two major attitudes before. One was Mashai, Mashrab Mashai, peripatetic current. One was Ishraqi, illumination. Ibn Sina was born in 370 after Hijrah and died 488. He had just 58 years when he died. Ishraqi mainly is developed by Sheikh Shahabuddin Suhrawardi, known as Sheikh Ishraq, who was born in 549 and died in 587. Only 38 years old. This man, when died, was only 38 years old. He says, Sheikh Abudiad makes a very good point here. He says, although Masha'un and Ishraqiyun both had philosophical approach, but they are very different. And for Mulla Sadra, this is like two rivers, two currents. When it comes to Kalam, again, there were different kind of attitudes. For example, he says one was Ash'ari, one was Mu'tazili. And they're very different. As you know, they had lots of debates, hot debates, Ash'arite and Mu'tazilite. But both of them were somehow against philosophy. They were kalam, not philosophy. So we consider them as one current, the Nehliya or Mashrab Kalami. So Mashrab Falsafi we divide into two. Mashrab Kalami, they don't make big differences for our purpose, although they have lots of differences. And Irfan also mainly is Ibn Arabi, what we are going to discuss, because he is somehow that has very much influenced theoretical Irfan especially, and therefore he is the main figure that we will talk. And of course he's Shurrah, commentators, student, etc. Ibn Arabi was born in 560 and died in 638. So he was 78 years old when he died. So before Mulla Sadra, we are faced with four currents. Mashrab Falsafi Mashai, peripatetic philosophical current. Mashrab Falsafi Ishraqi, illuminationist philosophical current. mashrab irfani, mystical current, and mashrab kalami, theological current. There are four kind of currents that we have to consider and discuss. When people, scholars, are faced with these differences, so it is very natural that some people think that they should bring reconciliation to see how we can bring these four closer to each other, if possible. So some people try to reconcile. Ibn Sina was one of these people. In the beginning, he was not very much in favor of Irfan. But towards the end of his life, he was very much inclined towards Irfan. And you know that the 9th section of Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, which is about Maqamatul Arifin, the stations of the wayfarers or mystics, which we alhamdulillah studied before, was very last thing that Ibn Sina wrote. And he tries to bring intellectual explanation of mystical ideas. It's very good and it's a masterpiece, but of course he was not a kind of mystic. So he tried, but he didn't succeed 100%. Sheikh Ishraq himself also tried. He was one of the people who wanted to reconcile between philosophy and Irfan. But he didn't manage to bring them together. He developed a new kind of mashrab or attitude. Khaja Nasir ad-Din Tusi Rizwanullah Ta'ala alayh, who was born in 597 and 672, managed to bring reconciliation between kalam and philosophy by writing Tajrid al-I'tiqad or Tajrid al-Kalam. He managed to bring reconciliation between kalam and philosophy, but in the favor of philosophy. After Khaja Nasir ad-Din Tusi, kalam is no longer able to be independent from philosophy, let alone criticize philosophy. Kalam is strengthened with philosophy. So Kalam somehow left this confrontation. But the confrontation between Mashrab Mashai, Mashrab Ishraqi, and Irfani remained. So Mulla Sadra inherited such confrontation, which has three major elements. Kalam is no longer a challenge, is more Mashrab Falsafiya Ishraqi, Mashrab Falsafiya Mashai, and Mashrab Irfani. Mystical attitude, peripatetic philosophical attitude, and illuminationist philosophical attitude. Ibn Turki, who was a philosopher and mystic of the 9th century, in Tamhidul Qawaid, he died in 835. So in Tamhidul Qawaid, which is one of the textbooks that they study for Irfan, he tried to reconcile, but Sheikh Ubudiyya says he didn't succeed. Muhaqqiq Dawani, who was born in 828 and died in 908, also tried to bring concept between philosophy and Irfan and Kalam somehow, especially by mentioning the idea of Zawq Ta'alluh. He tried to bring philosophy and Irfan together and bring something like a kind of his version of Wahdat al-Wujud, etc. It was somehow well received at the beginning. Even Mulla Sadra had some, maybe, not Mulla Sadra, but some people had, respect, but was not very successful. Mir Damad also developed something he called Hikmat Yamani. And he tried to sort something that Mulla Sadra in the beginning had interest in that, but that also didn't solve the problem. But Mulla Sadra first was influenced by this, and in his book Sarayanul Wujud, he was showing, acceptance of some of ideas of Mir Damad. But the idea of Jalaluddin Dawani was based on Asalatul Mahiyya, and Mulla Sadra went further and promoted or developed Asalatul Wujud. Therefore, these attempts made by Ibn Sina, by Shaykh Ishraq, by Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi, by Ibn Turka, by Jalaluddin Dawani, by Mir Damadi, they somehow brought some reconciliation, more or less, but still Mulla Sadra inherits three different currents: Falsafi Mashai, Falsafi Ishraqi, and Irfan. After this discussion, then we have a discussion about some of the distinctive features of transcendent philosophy. Shakhise. We want to talk about distinctive features of Hikmat Muta'aliyah. This needs more discussion. So there are 10 things that Sheikh Ubudiyat says about these distinctive features. And then he talks about Fasl Mumayyiz, like differentia, Fasl, gens of Fasl. So what is the distinctive differentia of Hikmat Muta'aliyah? Because there are things that are shared by Mashai, there are things that are shared by maybe Ishraqiyin. And then we have a discussion about methodology of transcendent philosophy. With this, chapter 2 finishes, and then we go into the issues or problems or masail. The very first mas'ala would be asalatul wujud wa i'tibariyatul mahiyya. I think we stop here, and then inshallah we can continue next week bi'iznillah from Shakhsiyya Hikmat Muta'aliyah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.